Ray Dalio stared at the four charts spread across his mahogany desk, his weathered hands trembling slightly as the weight of what he was seeing crashed down on him like a tidal wave. The grandfather clock in his Greenwich office struck midnight, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. What he had discovered would change everything, and the terrifying part was that he might be the only person on Earth who understood what was coming. The first chart showed something that made his stomach drop. It was a pattern he had seen only twice before in his 50-year career, and both times it had preceded catastrophic market collapses that wiped out trillions of dollars and destroyed millions of lives. But this time was different. This time the pattern was amplified, distorted, more dangerous than anything he had witnessed, even during the 2008 financial crisis that he had famously predicted. Ray's mind raced back to that humid September morning in 2007 when he had first spotted the early warning signs that would eventually lead to the worst financial disaster since the Great Depression. He had been younger then, more confident, more willing to sound the alarm. But now, at 76 years old, with decades of being proven right and wrong in equal measure, the burden of knowledge felt heavier than ever. That September morning had changed everything. Ray remembered sitting in this same office watching the housing market data scroll across his screens when something had clicked. The subprime mortgage patterns weren't just problematic, they were catastrophic. He had spent the next 3 days running calculations, cross-referencing data, building models that all pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. When he finally called his team together to share his findings, the room had fallen silent. Nobody wanted to believe what the numbers were telling them. But Ray had been right. 18 months later, Lehman Brothers collapsed, taking the global financial system with it. He had saved Bridgewater's clients billions of dollars, but the weight of being right about such devastation had never left him. How do you celebrate predicting the destruction of millions of people's life saving? The second chart on his desk revealed something even more unsettling. The debt cycle patterns that had made him famous, the very foundation of his principles philosophy, were showing a convergence that shouldn't be possible according to every economic model he had ever studied. Yet there it was, staring back at him in black and white, as undeniable as a mathematical proof. Ray had spent decades studying these cycles, watching how civilizations rose and fell based on their relationship with debt. The Roman Empire, the Dutch Golden Age, the British Empire, the American century, all had followed similar patterns. Periods of growth and prosperity, followed by overextension, then collapse and renewal. It was the rhythm of human civilization itself, and Ray had learned to read it like sheet music. He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the framed photograph of his younger self, shaking hands with Fed Chairman Paul Volcker in 1982. Back then, Ray had been just another ambitious hedge fund manager trying to understand the mysterious rhythms of global finance. Now he controlled over $2 trillion in assets, and his words could move markets with the force of an earthquake. But what good was all that power if he was seeing ghosts in the data? Ray stood up and walked to the massive windows overlooking Long Island Sound. The water was black and still under the moonless sky, reflecting nothing. Just like the markets right now, he thought, everything appeared calm on the surface, but underneath, massive currents were shifting in ways that most people couldn't even imagine. The memory of his biggest mistake flooded back without warning. It was 1982, and Ray had been absolutely certain that the U.S. economy was heading into a depression. He had positioned Bridgewater's portfolio accordingly, betting against American markets with every dollar he could leverage. But he had been wrong, dead wrong. Instead of a depression, the US entered the longest bull market in its history. That mistake had nearly destroyed him. He had been so confident in his analysis, so certain about the patterns he was seeing, that he had risked everything. When the markets moved against him, he lost so much money that he had to fire every employee at Bridgewater, except one. He had been forced to borrow $4,000 from his father just to pay his family's bills. The humiliation of that failure had taught him the most important lesson of his career. Even the smartest person in the room could be catastrophically wrong. It was that lesson that now made the four charts in front of him so terrifying, because this time he wasn't just confident in his analysis, he was certain. And if history had taught him anything, it was that certainty was the most dangerous emotion in finance. The third chart contained the most disturbing revelation of all. It showed a pattern in global liquidity flows that violated every assumption about how modern central banking was supposed to work. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the People's Bank of China were all moving in perfect synchronization, but in the wrong direction. It was as if four conductors were leading the same orchestra, but each was reading from a different piece of music, creating a cacophony that only someone with Ray's trained ear could detect. Ray had first noticed strange behavior in the overnight lending market 6 months ago. Banks that should have been lending to each other were hoarding cash instead. The rates they were charging each other for short-term loans were moving in patterns that suggested they knew something that the public markets didn't. It was subtle, almost invisible, unless you knew exactly what to look for. But to Ray, it was as obvious as a fire alarm. He had discovered this pattern completely by accident 3 weeks earlier, while analyzing seemingly unrelated data sets for a presentation to Bridgewater's institutional clients. At first, he had assumed it was a computer error, some glitch in the data feeds that his team of quants relied on to process millions of data points every day. But after running the analysis 17 different ways, using 7 different data sources, the pattern remained unchanged. The fourth signal was the most chilling of all. Ray had spent the last 48 hours diving deep into Federal Reserve reverse repo operations, studying the arcane mechanics of how the central bank managed liquidity in the banking system. What he found there had made him question everything he thought he knew about the stability of the global financial system. Ray's breathing became shallow as he remembered the moment when the fourth and final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place just hours earlier. He had been reviewing overnight repo market activity when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The pattern was identical to what he had observed in the weeks leading up to the collapse of long-term capital management in 1998, except this time it was happening across every major financial market simultaneously. The Federal Reserve was quietly preparing for something massive. The size and scope of their emergency lending facilities had been expanded far beyond anything that would be necessary for a normal recession. They were building the infrastructure for a complete breakdown of market functioning, the kind of crisis that would require the central bank to become the buyer and seller of last resort for virtually every financial instrument in existence. The implications were staggering. If his analysis was correct, the global financial system was heading toward a collapse that would make 2008 look like a minor correction. And according to his calculations, it would all begin in March 2026, just 14 months away. Ray walked back to his desk and picked up his secure phone, the one that connected him directly to the most powerful financial leaders in the world. His finger hovered over the speed dial for Fed Chairman Jerome Powell. One call could set in motion a chain of events that might prevent the coming disaster, but it could also trigger the very panic that would cause it. This was the curse of being right too often. Every prediction carried weight. Every warning had consequences. Ray remembered the aftermath of his 2007 warnings about subprime mortgages. He had been vindicated when Lehman Brothers collapsed, but he had also been blamed for contributing to the panic that made the crisis worse than it needed to be. The media had been brutal. Ray Dalio, prophet or fearmonger, had been the headline on the Wall Street Journal editorial that still haunted his dreams. The article had accused him of using his influence to manipulate markets for Bridgewater's benefit. Even though his warnings had ultimately saved thousands of investors from catastrophic losses, the accusation that he had profited from panic had never fully gone away. The clock ticked loudly in the silence as Ray wrestled with his conscience. His entire career had been built on the principle that markets were predictable if you understood the underlying patterns of human behavior and economic cycles. But what responsibility came with that knowledge? Was it better to warn people about a disaster you couldn't prevent, or to stay silent and hope you were wrong? He thought about his wife, Barbara, sleep upstairs, and his children and grandchildren, who would inherit whatever world emerged from the coming chaos. They had grown up with the privilege and security that his success had provided, but that same success now placed him in an impossible position. Ray walked to his bookshelf and pulled out his worn copy of The Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Duran. He had read it dozens of times, always searching for patterns that might help him understand the present moment. The book fell open to a passage he had underlined years ago: "A civilization is born stoic and dies Epicurean. The challenge of history is to recover the creative capacity of the first age and restore it to the last." Were they living in the last age of American economic dominance? Had the easy money policies of the past 15 years created the very Epicurean decadence that the Durants warned about? Ray believed they had, and the 4 charts on his desk proved it. Ray opened his laptop and began typing a memo that he knew would either save or destroy his reputation. The subject line read, "Critical alert, systemic risk assessment, March 2026. But before he could write the first sentence, he stopped. The weight of what he was about to unleash felt crushing. He closed the laptop and walked to his private bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. In the mirror, he saw an old man carrying the burden of terrible knowledge. His reflection reminded him of Alan Greenspan in the days before the dot-com bubble burst, or Ben Bernanke in the weeks before Lehman's collapse. They had all seen the signs, but they had all been trapped by the same impossible choice: speak and risk causing the disaster, or stay silent and let it happen anyway. Ray returned to his desk and studied the 4 charts again, hoping to find some error in his analysis, some reason to believe that this time was different. But the patterns were as clear as day. The debt supercycle that had been building since the end of World War II was finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. The central bank policies that had prevented major recessions for the past 15 years had only delayed the reckoning, not eliminated it. The first signal was hidden in the velocity of money, the rate at which dollars circulated through the economy. For months, Ray had watched this crucial indicator behaving in ways that defied explanation. It was moving in the opposite direction of what every economic theory predicted, suggesting that something fundamental had broken in the relationship between monetary policy and real economic activity. The Federal Reserve had pumped trillions of dollars into the system, but instead of stimulating growth, the money was disappearing into an economic black hole. The second signal was buried in the derivatives markets, where Ray had noticed unusual patterns in the pricing of credit default swaps on sovereign debt. The markets were pricing in risks that seemed impossible given the current economic environment, as if traders somewhere were anticipating events that hadn't been publicly discussed by any government or central bank. Someone was betting billions of dollars that major sovereign governments would default on their debt within the next 2 years. The third signal was the most subtle, but perhaps the most important. Ray had identified anomalies in global trade finance that suggested major international banks were quietly reducing their exposure to long-term commitments. It was the financial equivalent of animals fleeing before an earthquake, except the earthquake was still 14 months away. Credit lines that had been stable for decades were being quietly reduced or eliminated. Trade financing that should have been routine was being rejected for reasons that made no economic sense. But it was the fourth signal that had convinced Ray that a catastrophe was inevitable. Deep in the data from the Federal Reserve's reverse repo operations, he had found evidence that the central bank was preparing for a liquidity crisis of unprecedented scale. The Fed wasn't just planning for a recession, they were preparing for a complete breakdown of normal market functioning. They were building the infrastructure to become the ultimate buyer of last resort, not just for government bonds, but for every type of financial asset imaginable. Ray picked up his phone again, this time scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for his old friend Mohamed El-Erian, the former CEO of PINCO and one of the few economists Ray truly respected. Mohamed had been warning about the dangers of central bank policies for years, but even he didn't know what Ray had discovered. The phone rang twice before Mohamed's familiar voice answered. Ray, do you know what time it is? Mohamed, I need to run something by you. Can you talk securely? There was a pause. Mohamed had worked in the highest levels of global finance long enough to recognize the tone in Ray's voice. Hold on, let me get to my secure line. 2 minutes later, Mohamed was back. What's going on? Ray took a deep breath. I think we're looking at March 2026 for a complete systemic failure. I found 4 indicators that all point to the same conclusion. And Mohamed, I don't think anyone else is seeing this. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Finally, Mohamed spoke, his voice careful and measured. Walk me through it. For the next hour, Ray laid out his analysis in methodical detail, sending encrypted files and charts to Mohamed's secure email as they talked. He watched the timestamps on Mohamed's responses grow longer as the implications became clear. The velocity of money data is impossible, Mohamed said, after reviewing the first chart. This suggests that monetary policy has completely decoupled from real economic activity. Ray, this shouldn't be happening in a healthy economy. That's just the beginning, Ray replied, walking Mohamed through the derivatives market anomalies. Someone is positioning for sovereign defaults across multiple currencies simultaneously. This isn't hedging, this is speculation on a global scale. When they reached the third signal, Mohamed's tone became increasingly grave. Ray, if international banks are pulling back from trade finance at this scale, it means they know something we don't. Trade finance is the lifeblood of global commerce. You don't walk away from profits like this unless you're terrified of what's coming. But it was the fourth signal that broke Mohamed's composure entirely. Jesus Christ, Ray. The Fed is building a shadow banking system. They're preparing to replace the entire private banking sector if necessary. This is beyond anything we saw in 2008. Ray, Mohamed finally said, if you're right about this, We're not just talking about a financial crisis. This would be the end of the current global monetary system. Are you absolutely certain about your data? I've checked it 17 different ways. The pattern is unmistakable. Ray's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. The question is, what do we do about it? Have you spoken to anyone else about this? You're the first. I didn't want to move until I was sure. Mohamed was quiet for a long moment. Ray, if this gets out prematurely, it could trigger the very crisis you're predicting. But if you're right and we do nothing, millions of people will lose everything they have. Ray stared out at the dark water again. That's exactly the problem I'm facing. Every option leads to disaster. There might be a third way, Mohamed said slowly. What if we could find a way to gradually prepare the system without causing panic? Use your influence to encourage certain policy changes without revealing what you've discovered. You mean manipulate the market to prevent the collapse? I mean, save the global economy without destroying it in the process. Ray considered this. It was the kind of moral gray area that had always made him uncomfortable, but the alternative was potentially catastrophic for billions of people. How would we even begin something like that? We start with trusted allies, Mohamed replied. People who understand systemic risk and have the authority to act. Janet Yellen, Larry Summers, maybe Christine Lagarde. We don't tell them everything at first, just enough to get them asking the right questions. And if they don't believe us, then we escalate gradually. The key is to plant seeds of doubt about current policies without revealing the full scope of what you've discovered. Let them reach their own conclusions. Ray felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Mohamed, if we do this, and we're wrong, we'll have manipulated global financial policy based on our personal interpretation of market data. If we're right, but we cause the panic ourselves, we'll be responsible for the greatest economic disaster in human history. And if we do nothing, and you're right, we'll be responsible for letting it happen when we had the knowledge and influence to prevent it, Mohamed replied. Ray, you've been right about every major crisis of our lifetime. I trust your analysis more than I trust any government report or central bank assessment. Carefully, Mohamed replied. Very, very carefully. After the call ended, Ray sat alone in his office until dawn, wrestling with the implications of what he had set in motion. By agreeing to Mohamed's plan, he had crossed a line that he could never uncross. He was no longer just an observer of the markets. He was actively working to shape them based on his predictions about the future. Ray opened a new document on his laptop and began outlining their strategy. Phase 1 would involve subtle position changes at Bridgewater, shifts that would signal caution to other institutional investors without triggering alarm. Phase 2 would include carefully worded warnings in his public speeches, highlighting specific risks without revealing the full scope of his analysis. Phase 3 would be direct communication with policymakers, assuming the first two phases didn't trigger the policy changes necessary to prevent the crisis. But as the sun rose over Long Island Sound, painting the water gold and orange, Ray realized that he had already made his choice the moment he picked up the phone. The only question now was whether he and Mohamed could execute their plan before March 2026 arrived, bringing with it the collapse of everything the modern world had built. Ray Dalio had seen the future, and it was coming whether he warned about it or not. The four signals were clear. The timeline was set. And the only remaining question was whether humanity would be ready for what was coming next. As he finally closed his laptop and prepared to face another day of maintaining the illusion that everything was normal, Ray knew that these next 14 months would determine the fate of the global economy for generations to come. The patterns never lied. They had told him about every major crisis of his lifetime, and now they were telling him about the biggest crisis of all. Whether anyone would listen or whether it was already too late remained to be seen. But Ray Dalio had done what he always did. He had seen the truth hidden in the data, even when that truth was more terrifying than anyone wanted to believe. As the clock struck 6 a.m., Ray made his final decision. He would begin implementing the plan immediately, starting with a carefully worded memo to his senior staff about emerging market volatilities and systemic risk factors that warrant careful monitoring. It wasn't the full truth, but it was the beginning of a careful campaign to save the world economy from itself. The race against March 2026 had begun.